I strongly recommend that those who suffer from thalassophobia watch another video. Based on an incredible true story, the movie begins with a brief explanation about the work of saturation divers, who are responsible for the maintenance of the pipelines that extend to the ocean floor. Divers can reach depths over 300 meters, where sunlight barely reaches. All this without considering the difficulties they face. It's one of the best jobs in the world, but also one of the most dangerous. In the next scene, we meet Chris Lemons, a Scottish diver who has just been called up for a month of work. This interrupts his plans with his fiancée Maura, who, far from being upset, is concerned about the nature of Chris's work. He assures her that it's like being in space but in the water. He doesn't think that makes it any less unsettling. Despite his fiancée's nerves, Chris loves being a diver, and he arrives with a smile at the port of Aberdeen, the diving operations base in the North Sea. Among other colleagues, he meets Duncan Alcock, a veteran diver and good friend. At the moment of selecting the diving teams, the superior Craig pairs Chris and Duncan with Mr. Sympatia David Joseph, a bitter guy who only carries that nickname due to a lack of charisma. However, Chris shows up with his best attitude, admitting he wanted to work with him, despite their differences. The divers settle into their new home for the next 28 days, a pressurized chamber that simulates conditions similar to those 90 meters below the sea. Thanks to this, they can maintain the required pressure throughout their workday. As soon as he arrives, Chris puts a photo of his fiancée on his bunk, and David quickly warns him that once the chamber closes, everything outside is a distraction. Before Chris can respond, Duncan tells him to ignore David. He's only like that at work. Outside, he's more relaxed. Once the divers are in their chambers, the doors close and the ship sets sail. The divers pass the time with hobbies and chatter. Duncan tells them how basic diving was in his youth. He's one of the few left from that era. Maybe that's why they want to retire him. This news surprises both Chris and David, as Duncan had kept it to himself until now. While a break wouldn't hurt, he feels he has 10 more years left in the tank. In that context, Chris promises this last dive together will be memorable, and it sure will be. Upon reaching the dive zone, the ship's captain, Andre Jensen, is concerned about the weather conditions, as a strong storm is battering the seas. However, Craig reminds him that this is how the North Sea is, which is why he gives the divers the green light. During the preparation, Duncan takes on the role of lookout from the diving bell, which means Chris and David must go down. Therefore, David tells his partner to follow him at all times. With the three in position, the bell descends to 91 meters deep. Despite some storm turbulence, these divers aren't new to the game. At least David and Duncan are. David jumps in first, followed by Chris. They endure 6 hours in darkness. Duncan stays in the bell, monitoring the condition of his companions and distributing the umbilical lines that provide them with communication, power, and oxygen. When they reach the seabed, the divers head to the designated manifold, supplying it with electricity before starting to repair the pipes. Everything goes well in the depths, although on the surface the situation is different. Suddenly, the ship's dynamic positioning system, DPS, starts to fail, causing the thrusters to shut down. As a result, the ship is dragged by the ocean currents from the depths. David notices this and warns Chris to get out of the collector immediately. Then, Chris and David decide to climb onto the collector to avoid further complications. David arrives without any problems, but Chris's cord loses tension before his ascent, becoming entangled in the structure of the collector. Inevitably, the diving bell is carried by the ship, dragging Chris along with it. Despite his effort to hold on, his cord begins to break, abruptly interrupting his oxygen supply. David, keeping calm, tells him to switch to his emergency reserve, which provides him with an estimated 10 minutes of oxygen. Aware of what is happening, David clarifies that in a matter of seconds his rope will completely break, so he recommends that he stay on top of the collector. This way he can come back for him. While David is dragged by the bell, Chris falls into the depths. Duncan realizes the situation in the worst way, retrieving the broken cord from the water. Chris's accident alarms the entire crew. Craig and Jensen begin to plan a way to rescue him. They cannot anchor due to the proximity of several gas lines. Cutting one of them could cause an ecological catastrophe the captain won't risk. With 8 minutes of oxygen left, Chris lights a flare on the seabed. He desperately calls his companions, but there's only darkness and silence. Refusing to give up, he remembers David recommended climbing onto the collector. That has become his goal. On the surface, the crew realizes that the thrusters are not damaged, they just shut down due to the SPD failure. Therefore, Jensen and the first officer decide to manually maneuver the thrusters to stay close to Chris. This is a tactic that is generally used in ports, but the current situation justifies it with its poor lighting. Chris reaches the collector and begins to climb it. In the middle of the ascent, his flare falls. Luckily he has more. Already at the top, the diver feels his oxygen running out, and with it his very life. He remembers the last message from his fiancée, who begged him to come home for good. After this job, the oxygen gauge reaches its end. The countdown of time without oxygen on the ship begins. Officer Mike receives the order to expedite the SPD restart, which usually takes a few hours. At the same time, Operator Andrew tries to locate Chris with an ROV vehicle. Although he finds him on the collector, the diver is unconscious from lack of oxygen and has involuntary spasms. He's been like that for 7 minutes. Clinging to life, Craig suggests using the ROV's claws to rescue Chris, but Andrew doesn't dare to do it. Given that this vehicle is normally used to transport bodies, the claws could be dangerous. Nevertheless, Craig refuses to let one of his men die, so he takes control of the ROV. Following Andrew's advice, Craig manages to grab the harness of Chris's suit with the claw. Unfortunately, when the ascent begins, they encounter another wall, as the diver had tied himself to the manifold to avoid being swept away by the tide. 16 minutes without oxygen and counting. During the tense wait, Duncan tells David about the day he met Chris. In fact, it was under rather sad circumstances, as they were assigned to recover the bodies from a shipwreck. Despite all their efforts, they were unable to find the last body, so the deceased's wife only received a box with belongings. Duncan, in tears, refuses to give Morag the same. David, on the other hand, assures that this will not be the case. They are going to recover their friend. At that moment, Mike manually restarts the SPD, allowing the vessel to precisely approach the collector. Likewise, they re-establish communication with Duncan and David's bell, informing them that Chris is still alive. Once near the collector, David dives to unanchor Chris and take him with him. Or at least he tries to, since they submerge the bell as much as possible, and that has consequences. However, David manages to hold onto the cord while Duncan gives him strength to climb up to the bell. After a titanic effort, the diver reaches his destination, with Chris ending his count without oxygen, a total of 28 minutes. Duncan gives mouth to mouth, and miraculously his young friend breathes again. The problem is he only does that, not responding to any other stimulus. Due to prolonged lack of oxygen, it seems he has severe brain damage. Duncan and David try talking to him, but get no response. Despite this, Duncan thanks his partner for bringing him back, and he responds that they both did it. At least they'll have something to return tomorrow. That's right, the dead man is talking, and that's because he's not dead. By the work and grace of who knows who, Chris is alive. The uproar erupts on the ship, with everyone celebrating the miracle they achieved together. The irony is that Chris has no idea what's going on. Duncan jokingly tells him that they kissed, but the details are for later. Finally, the captain gives the order to take the diver home with the bell. Back on the ship, the decompression process begins, while Duncan and David take care of Chris's recovery. When he learns that he was without oxygen for so long, he admits that he should have died. The diver can't help but feel bad for his wife. Remembering that he promised to return to her arms safe and sound, he almost didn't make it. When David prepares to let him rest, he stops him by taking his hand and sincerely thanks him for saving him. Thanks to him, his fiancée will have a husband. After this, David takes a photo of his 2 daughters from his bag, knowing well how Chris feels. Already recovered, Chris calls Murad and informs him that he will return home earlier than planned due to a problem on the ship, and not to worry on his last day of decompression. The divers leave the chambers and return to solid ground, but Duncan turns around with the excuse of looking for something he forgot, spends a long time in the chamber, unable to believe this is his last time. Craig, who was watching him through the cameras, asks what's going on. Duncan replies that he doesn't feel ready to be discarded. Changing the scene, Chris finally returns home and tells his wife about an incident with a diver. He got trapped on the seabed and needed rescuing. He almost didn't make it. Chris doesn't need to give more details. Soon Morag realizes the diver was him. A wave of anguish floods her, though Chris assures her he always knew he'd return. The real Chris Lemon spent 29 minutes without oxygen. Despite the theories in the scientific community, the truth is that no one has managed to explain how he could survive for so long. Chris married his fiancée, and just 3 weeks after the accident, he returned to the bottom of the North Sea with his friends David and Duncan to finish the work that had been left unfinished. Now don't be like the ship's positioning system. Don't shut down. Keep watching more of our videos.